All right. Thank you folks for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Tamara Nazala. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Amelia Virtual Care's webinar on bridging the gap between the head and the heart with our guest speaker, Erica Cates. And Erica is joining us from Oak Park, Illinois, where she has a private practice. She is also Amelia's Vice President of Behavioral Health. She works globally with our clients, helping them bring virtual reality into their practice. She was trained in both CBT and psychodynamic treatment at Columbia University's School of Social Work in New York City. She's also trained in EMDR, and she's got extensive experience working with clients struggling with trauma, relationships, depression, anxiety, feelings of suicidality and homicidality. So she's able to talk about a range of things. We had some really good questions. Thank you to those who submitted them as part of your registration. And so we will start off by just actually giving you an overview of what VR in therapy looks like and how it works. And then we'll go into some case studies to touch on bridging the gap. And with that, I'll turn it over to Erica. Actually, one more thing. If you guys have questions during the session, I'll be monitoring the Q&A, and we will get to as many questions as we can.
Thank you. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. So as Tamara mentioned, we'll just talk really high level about using VR in your practice. Mostly this was driven by the questions we got prior to today about like how it works. And then we'll really get into the subject matter of bridging the gap. So VR is just what it sounds like. You can see here in the picture, those are virtual reality goggles. They're 3D, right, environments that you put the goggles on and you're immersed in a whole new place. Actually, the clinical application of VR in behavioral health has been studied for a really long time, about the last 30 years. In the States, a lot of that research started and continues to happen at the VA. The VA is one of the earliest adopters of VR, and what I'm sure many of you already know, when you think about VR and mental health, you often think about like PTSD, trauma, specifically, going into a virtual reality of a war and right, kind of using prolonged exposure to treat. The world of VR in behavioral health has expanded far beyond that, but that's where a lot of its roots, especially in the States, where it started. And what's really shifted recently is accessibility, right? So in the beginning, you saw places like the VA using VR, but it was really, really hard for the sort of mom and pop clinician to use because the technology was so expensive. But over the last several years, the technology has become less expensive and more affordable, and that's really allowed it to become accessible to clinicians just like myself working in a solo practice. And as you can see here, we talk about large health systems, and that's true around the world, right? In the UK, NHS, for example, one of the earliest adopters of VR, they still use it. They one of our customers actually, along with the VA. But one of the things we just want to really highlight today is that while VR really started in the treatment of, exposure and PTSD, we've really seen it grow far beyond that. And not that exposure and PTSD aren't still core to VR and mental health, but, it's also used for mindfulness. It's also used for social skills training. It's used for eating disorders. It really covers much, much more. Substance abuse. We see it really expanding. So, okay, how do therapists use it? And this is just one slide to kind of talk you through how it works. So as you can see, we have a VR platform. That's a web-based platform. Therapists log in and they have access to a ton of environments. And from that platform, they get a pairing code and they can send an environment to a mobile app or to a VR headset. The mobile app allows you to treat remotely. You can put the mobile app into 3D goggle mode that literally turns your phone into VR goggles, and you can slide that phone into a universal headset that you can buy off Amazon, and boom, you have VR at home. One of the things that is really, really awesome about virtual reality is its customization, and the therapist's ability to sort of control what the patient is seeing, control if they're in an airplane, is it day or night in that airplane? Is there a storm going on, or is it, a clear night or clear day? Is it turbulent or is it not turbulent? These are all sort of customizations and controls that were a lot hard, really impossible to do prior to VR. Okay. All right, so that's high level how you use VR in a therapist's office or in treatment. But what I do want to talk about now is moving into this subject of the gap between the head and the heart. It's the way we define it, right, is when a feeling or a sentiment does not match a cognitive understanding or perspective. I see this a lot with trauma. I mean, we can see it in all sorts of different disorders, but perfect example is you have a patient walk in and report just tremendously horrible story, and they have a flat affect as they're telling you, right? Or a blunted affect. They're just like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And you're sitting there going, like, feeling more emotive than the patient. That's a perfect example of the gap we're referring to. You don't just see it in trauma though, right? I have a vet who we'll talk about later, who I treat, who's comes in and is telling me how angry he is with his wife. And at every step of the way, he's incredibly calm, right? It's for different reasons. But that's what we're going to be talking about today. And here are just some examples, right, of that gap. Yeah, Erica, rationally, I know I'm lovable, but emotionally, I feel worthless. How many times have we all heard patients say this, especially kind of when we're trying to change that irrational thought? And, I have a patient, we can call her Lucy, who's really struggling with emotional regulation. And sort of this comes up a lot in dating, right? So she is dating a guy and he doesn't text her back immediately. And she starts to feel very, very anxious. And she knows, okay, I know where this anxiety is coming from. I know that this is making me feel worthless. I know that that is irrational. I know I'm lovable, but in that moment, I cannot stop myself from texting him 15 texts being like, where are you? Why aren't you responding? It's been 20 minutes, because emotionally that feeling is still a feeling of worthlessness. And so that's right about changing a core belief. And it's a good example of that sort of gap between head and heart. In her head, she knows she's lovable. In her heart, she still feels worthless, right? Here's my example of Ken, my vet. By the way, all these names are fake, but the stories are real. Just so you all know. He's telling me about the sort of division of labor in his household, which is that from his perspective, he does like 90% of the household duties, and he's sharing example after example. And he's clearly very angry, or at least what I should say is the content of what he is sharing with me about doing 90% of the household duties. She goes out to dinner on Friday night and I clean up the kitchen and I do all the dishes. Why? So that she can come home to a sparkling clean kitchen, even though it's not my night to do the dishes, Erica. I'm just doing them, right? And then it's all good. Like, I'm happy to do it. But then the next morning, the kid cries. He has a young child, and it's her day to pick him up out of the crib. And what does she do? She nudges me and is like, oh, can you get him? And I'm just, but she's so wonderful, Erica. And this is how he's reporting it, right? He's not presenting as angry. His affect is full. He's talking about how much he loves her. But like, I don't know, if this was my experience, I'd be pretty pissed off. So that's just another example where what's going on up here does not match what he's at least allowing himself to experience or feel in my office. And that might be different at home. Likely it is different at home, right? But there's a piece of him that needs to present a certain way to me. And then we'll talk about Jamie. And Jamie is that story of reporting really bad trauma as she's completely flat affect or blunted affect. Okay. So there are all these different examples, right, of this gap between head and heart. And often I think when we think about that, we think about, okay, but what is driving that gap, right? And often it's fear, right? I think for Lucy, it's fear, because if she were, in her case, and you guys don't know her story, but if she were to bridge that gap and believe that she was lovable, it would have all sorts of implications for all sorts of narratives in her life. And it would mean things about the messages she got that she was worthless. What does it mean about the people who gave her those messages? And that's really scary to confront. And so there's a lot of fear around wanting to bridge that gap. Right. For Ken, I think, and he's very invested in presenting as in a certain way, right? Ken really struggles with negative emotion across the board. He has a very, very long and complicated trauma history. And he's always finding the silver lining. That's his coping strategy. So if he were to connect with those negative emotions and really admit how rough it's been for him at times, that's also scary. And then he has a lot of shame wrapped up, right? So that really drives this kind of need to present very measured, very kind of calm as he's talking about something that's really quite upsetting. And for Jamie, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the case studies, it also is this idea of fear and shame, right? In her story, what would it mean to integrate that experience into her understanding of self is a really painful experience. It's hard. And it again has implications about other people in her life. Okay. So when we think about bridging that gap, we want to first address the barrier. And then we want to help them feel the content of what they're saying. And one of the key ways that we can do that is by really getting them immersed in whatever they're talking about. And of course, I'm going to talk about VR today, but I just want to highlight that you probably all do this every day. Whether or not you use VR, right? When someone is saying something that's incredibly sad and they have a blunted affect, what do? We often pause, or we ask the patient, can we just sit with this for a sec? Or we reflect the same statement and then say, that sounds really, really hard, and pause. And that pause, why are we pausing? Because we're trying to give them time and space and a sense of safety to really sit with those words, with the hope that they start to be more immersed in that story, right? Sometimes I have a patient who, I'm not talking about today, but I'll just throw this out there, who also has a really, really rough trauma story. And when she first shared this story, she was incredibly blunted. And I was crying, right? And that was a way to help bridge that gap. And I'll never forget this. She looked at me and she's like, "Why are you crying?" "I'm not crying." And I was like, "I'm crying because I find this story incredibly sad." And then I paused, right? and I paused and I paused, and I'm a talker. So pausing for me is a practice. And I just sat, and eventually what happened, she's like, well, now I'm crying. Um, and she was so scared to cry, right? She was so scared to allow that memory. And this particular patient was dropped at an orphanage by her biological mother when she was 4 years old, and her memory is of trying to remember all the street signs so she would know how to get back home from the back of the car. And mom couldn't afford to feed her. It was actually the kindest thing mom could have done. She was saving her daughter's life by bringing her to the orphanage, but nevertheless, it's an incredibly, right, tragic story. So that pause, that is about immersion. It is about getting that person to connect what they think in their head to what they feel in their heart. Okay, so there are lots of ways to do this. There are tried and true ways that we've just talked about: pausing, repeating back, taking a deep breath, reflecting an appropriate affect to the patient, not purposely. I'm not trying to suggest that, but if it happens, it's often grist for the mill, and it works wonders, right? When you're so touched by a story that maybe you start to cry, that's another way. VR is another way. And we use VR a lot to do that. So let's talk a little bit. So the first example we're going to talk about is Jamie, but I realize anyway, Jamie is a 40-year-old female. Her biological father remains involved in her life, but when she was 7 years old, her biological mother had gotten remarried, and she was remarried to a man who was a cop. And the reason this is important is because the cop, this man had like a very steady job, good health insurance, good benefits, survivors benefits, all that stuff. And Jamie's mom wanted to make sure that, God forbid, something were to happen to her now husband, her daughter would be taken care of. And so Jamie's mom, thinking this is a really good idea, goes to her new husband and talks to him about adopting Jamie. And they go to Jamie's biological father, and Jamie's biological father is like, yep, this is fine. I think this is a good idea. Like, I'll still be involved in Jamie's life, but sure, I'm waiving my parental rights, go adopt her. And so stepdad becomes adoptive dad. And Jamie is 7, right? And really has no voice in this story. But what she remembers is coming home from school on a Thursday and being sat down in her living room by her mom and a soon-to-be adoptive father, and being told, congratulations, you should be so excited. You're going to skip school tomorrow because we're going to go to the courthouse because, Tom is going to become your dad. Aren't you so excited, Jamie? Isn't this so great? And Jamie, doesn't really react and goes to the courthouse and is adopted. And one of the key parts of this story is that Jamie's last name is changed, and her last name is changed from her biological father's last name, which is a Spanish last name, to her adoptive father's last name, who is not Spanish. And in that moment, Jamie now recognizes this as a 40-year-old adult, but in that current, obviously not as a 7-year-old child, Jamie's parents kind of changed, what her identity, or at least what the identity of her name means and what it presents to the world. And so Jamie's telling me this story, and I am really kind of shocked. I really, let me just back up as a mom. I really understand Jamie's mother's desire to, right, ensure that Jamie has some really concrete financial safeties in place. And I understand that that is largely what, and Jamie's confirmed this, has motivated mom's decision all those years ago. But the lack of awareness around what they were doing or thought, at least from Jamie's experience, is just remarkable. So anyway, Jamie's telling me this and my face is like, wait, I'm sorry, right? Like I'm responding like in shock. And she's like, yeah, it's just what happened. And I, asked, well, how did that make you feel? And she's like, I mean, it was fine, whatever. And again, there's just a complete kind of shutdown. And so we talk about it a little bit more, and I highlight kind of where I'm like, it would be okay if you had some feelings about this. That's a lot. And she starts saying, well, I wasn't really allowed to have feelings about it because I knew that if I had expressed anything but excitement about going on Friday and missing school and going to the courthouse, I knew I would be told that I was ungrateful, that I was a brat, that I was spoiled. My mom and my adoptive father, they had a very specific expectation for how I respond. And it, so that's just what I did. And that's just how it is. And, and so what I ended up doing was I asked her if she'd be open to sort of jumping into virtual reality, into an environment. And she looks at me and she's like, huh? And I'm like, just be willing to go with it. She's like, yeah. So we have a fear of darkness environment. Now, Jamie's not scared of the dark, but it's a house. It's that you can interact with. So I had her go to the living room of the house, and her avatar sitting in the chair, like a big chair, looking at the couch. And I said, okay, I want you to imagine that this is your living room, the place where your parents told you this, and that they're sitting on that couch across the way. She's like, okay. I was like, and I want you to take a minute and really imagine it. And then I want you to tell me this story again. And tell it to me as if it's happening right now. And she does. And she starts to cry. And she starts to talk about what this was really like. And it's interesting because most of my questioning or whatever prior to bringing this up was really focused on like the way this message was delivered from mom and adoptive dad. But in Jamie's reliving of this, right, within this house, this virtual house, one of the things that we hadn't yet touched on and sort of talking through this was how angry she was at her biological father. Like, why the hell would you be okay with that? Why would you say, sure, go ahead and adopt her? What was he thinking, right? And the level of rejection that she felt from that. And so this is just one example, right, of how immersion can bridge that gap between our heads and our hearts. And again, all the patient information, the stories are real, but the patient information, the demographics have been slightly changed, except for the part about the last name. That's all true. Okay, so we're going to talk about Ken again, my vet, would want you to know he's a Marine. Okay. No longer an active duty, but a Marine. So Ken is telling me this story about the division of labor. It's important to know, Ken is married with his first child, and his first child's about 18 months now, and living with a pretty rare genetic condition that requires a lot of additional caregiving. And I point this out because it's right that how many of us have seen patients that are in the first 2 years with their first kid, and they're just like they're so angry with their spouse because they're sleep deprived, and it's such a huge transition. This has got an added layer of transition to it because their child does have a lot of special needs. But so Ken is telling me the story, full affect, really saying some pretty like content that would make anyone very angry, right? I love my wife. She's the best. Let me just be really clear. She is the best. Like she is so out of my league. She's so great. But I did that. I tried to do that task where I really tried to itemize and understand what we're both doing at home. I didn't do it with her. I had asked him to do it with her, but he didn't do it with her. I didn't do it with her, but I went through and I was itemizing kind of all the tasks. And Erica, I'm doing like everything. I'm doing like 90% of the work. And I don't know what to do about it. And I started to talk to her about it. And I got so upset that I just was like, this can't happen anymore. And I was like, okay. I was like, it's okay for you to get angry. What would it look like for you to get angry in here? And Marines, we don't get angry. Okay. I don't know exactly what that means because anger is a normal human emotion, but okay. Right. And he's so scared to get angry, angry in front of me, angry in front of his wife, angry towards his wife. So I put him in VR and I put him in a restaurant because within this restaurant, he's sitting across the table from a female avatar. And I said, I want you to pretend this is your wife. We'll call her Jane, not her real name. Pretend this is Jane. And let's really try to talk to her about what you're angry about. It's like, okay. And I pretend I'm putting in the words of Jane. One of the things she says that drives him crazy is, I need you to do. So that's how I start this. I need you to go upstairs and change the printer cartridge because I can't print this thing. And he loses it. Not screaming, very tonal, but like, I'm not effing doing that right now. And he starts getting really angry. And I, from there, I'm like, it's okay to get angry. You're allowed to get angry. Let's talk through this. And so from there, we were able to start. First, he just needed to get angry. And then we were able to say, okay, how are we actually going to deal with this? What is it going to look like to go home and talk to Jane about this in a way that isn't you completely emotionally shutting down and just leaving the room? Because that's what he had done prior. Because that's not going to help this get better. And what came up in all of this is that part of the reason he's so angry with her is that often when she's not helping with the house, it's because she's overworked at her job. And he feels that she sets no boundaries at work for her work world. And so we talked about like, okay, but your wife wants to get Jane. Do you know where Jane wants to move in her career? And do you know what Jane feels like she needs to do in order to get there? And right, because maybe she feels like she legitimately does need to be working 60 to 80 hours a week. And if that's the case, and that's really important to her, how do you sort of manage within that paradigm and talk through that paradigm and maybe ask her to change that paradigm if it's really not working? But it was only when I put him in VR that he was able to really get angry. That you could see it, right? His affect was no longer full, especially once he took the VR goggles off. I could fully see it. He was pissed. Understandably so. If what he reports is accurate, like I'd be pissed too. But so that's just another example of, I could have done that same thing without VR and done a role play, but the difference is my space still grounds him in the fact that this is a role play. I don't just become an anonymous, right, woman or an anonymous kind of tabula rasa that he can project his wife onto. Whereas the avatar in virtual reality that doesn't look like me, that might not look like Jane either, but clearly is a neutral, more tabula rasa sort of image, made it much easier for him to really project his wife there. And so that's another example. Okay. Final thoughts, and then I think we'll open it up for questions.
Erica, We
Yeah.
had you just touched on it a bit with that example, and in the previous example, um Jean Kondrasty was asking also, like, why do you think the VR environment made a difference versus just closing your eyes? So can you?
So, yeah. So closing your eyes, I think one of the problems with it's not a problem. It can work great plenty of times. But the we as human beings, like we're sort of wired to avoid pain, right? Like that's pain feels bad. We don't want to feel it. Like we avoid it. And in therapy, what we're trying to do is say, hey, avoid that sort of biologic impulse to run from this discomfort and actually like let's pull in some Buddhism and turn towards that pain. Let's embrace that pain. So when we ask folks to imagine, we cannot control what they're imagining. And it's often very hard to imagine the thing that you're afraid of or sad about or like just gut wrenchingly, right? Fearful slash traumatized by. It's really, really hard to do that. Especially in trauma, one of the things I will say that I have observed a lot over the years, and they teach you this in EMDR training actually too, is that when we ask folks to imagine, often whatever they're imagining gets clouded out by whatever the really scary trauma is. And so for Jamie, for example, I wanted her to sit in that painful memory, but not to the point that now she's remembering every other traumatic thing that's happened to her that overwhelms the memory of sitting in that living room. I want her in the living room. And so by painting that picture for her using VR, it grounds her much more in that experience versus, Jamie was also sexually assaulted later in life. Like lots of other things happened to Jamie that I did not want those I did not want those intruding on this particular conversation. But the other thing is, if I ask Jamie to remember, she might not be able to fully do that, or her brain might protect her from wanting to remember it so much that it's just less effective, right? When I asked her to sit with it, what happened? This is just what happened, Erica, like whatever, right? It was only after she was in an environment that was sort of curated for her, but not her own making, that we saw that work. So for Jamie's example, and for many examples, that's one of the benefits of not using imagination. The other thing I'll say that we haven't talked at all about today, but I'll throw out there is with exposure therapy, one of the problems with, right, there's in vivo exposure, there's imaginal exposure, and then there's VR exposure. And in imaginal exposure, you're doing just that. You are asking the patient to imagine whatever they're afraid of. And you as the therapist have no insight into what they're actually imagining and if they're ratcheting up that level of anxiety, which is what you want to happen in exposure, right? So it's like, okay, first I want you to imagine being on a plane. Now I want you to imagine a plane at absolute highest turbulence. Like, let's just say, I have no idea if the patient's actually doing that. And I adore my patients, and I think they're very wonderful people who want what's best. But at the same time, their limbic system is telling them, no, I'm not going to imagine it at the most turbulent. Like, don't do that. Don't do that. And so that's where VR can help with that in the Jamie example, in those sorts of examples. But Tamara, do you mind? I feel like there was also a piece of that with the Ken. Was that, did I answer the question?
You did, and it's brought up a couple other statements and questions here. So, as a therapist trained in sensory motor psychotherapy, I can see how immersing a client in the VR experience can assist with processing and experiencing aspects of overwhelming events. But does the VR experience take away from being more connected to one's physical somatic experience in that very moment?
So it depends how you practice. I would say no, it shouldn't. And that's because so like my colleague in Spain who uses Amelia all the time, one of the environments I'll just use as an example is we have a fear of needles environment, and he treats a lot of folks with this fear, especially during COVID. There were a lot of people coming in. He actually has a tourniquet in his office, for example. So when the person is in VR, he's also like tying the tourniquet on their arm so that they are still like, in their body and grounded. Now, on the flip side, there's a lot of research right now about embodiment in VR, which is this whole concept of what happens when your avatar in VR looks nothing like you. And then in that case, to the question, yes, it would be the exact opposite. You're not grounded in your body. And it's incredible. There's some incredibly interesting outcomes being found. And I'll just give one example out of Stanford, which is that they had two people go into a negotiation in VR, and one person's avatar would be taller than the other. And the person whose avatar was taller was not reflective of their own height. So I'm very short. So for example, I could go in and my avatar could be 6 foot. And regardless of people's actual physicality, their stance within the negotiation was reflective of their avatar, not their physical body. And it was just a super interesting finding, because I guess in general, people who are taller tend to be more aggressive in negotiation than people who are shorter. So the people who were taller in real life but had shorter avatars in the simulation would become less aggressive, and the people who were shorter in real life but had taller avatars would become more aggressive. And then if your avatar size matched your actual size, you would perform whatever, either less aggressive based on, you're shorter, or more aggressive based on you're taller. Hope that answers the question. So I guess it's a yes and no answer. It depends how you're practicing. But for those of us really using it for treatment, for phobias and for treatment of trauma, I think there are many of us that try very hard to be aware of the physical body as well, whether it's the tourniquet or whether it's me encouraging my patient in real life to ground down and stamp their feet on the floor and notice where they are and all that stuff, and take deep breaths to be aware of sort of their physical bodies while in this virtual world. I hope that helps.
Yeah. There's kind of one more nuance here that Adam was touching on, and he's asking, so VR allows to create a degree of separation, allowing the patient to lower their inhibitions and be more emotionally honest. Would you?
I think actually it depends. I think in the example of Jamie, that's not what was happening. It's not that it lowered her inhibitions. I think it kind of, this sounds mean, and I don't mean it that way, but in a good way, it overwhelmed her to the point that she had no choice but to connect with those feelings. In the Ken example, I think yes, it did lower his inhibitions because he felt much more. He kind of for a second forgot that the role play was with his therapist, right? And so in that way, I think it did lower inhibitions. The part that I think is really interesting about your question, which we do see a lot in VR, and this comes up in embodiment research as well, is that when we have some awareness that it's not real, we are much more likely to adopt a differing perspective. So an example is treating someone with a fear of driving, okay? When they're in VR and I'm like, okay, we're gonna speed up, they're like, okay. And whereas if I were to get in a car with them and be like, go speed up, they're like, hell no. but they're more willing to try something different in VR because they, on some level, know it's not real. And what we find is that over time then changes their response in real life. So one of my colleagues and another Amelia user named Dr. Gurr, Howie Gurr, he's actually going to be speaking at an APA conference coming up about a lot of this. But one of the things he talks about all the time is that he will use the Amelia driving environment like for a good 5 to 6 weeks with a patient and have them practice making those changes in VR. And by the time he's done doing it in VR, he's like, okay, today's the day. You're going to FaceTime me. You're going to get in the car and you're going to drive. They're ready for that now, because even though they were only agreeing to do these things because they knew it wasn't real, it still created like some muscle memory of doing it in the first place. It's kind of like the studies that have come up that like imagining playing the piano and practicing playing by imagining it is almost as good as practicing it by like actually being at the piano. I hope that answers that question. Tamara, are we? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think there were a lot of good questions on that topic, and I think we touched on all of these. So I'll let you continue because I think I interrupted your flow here a little bit.
No, I don't think you did. I think we're actually, so we're at final thoughts. Okay, so final thoughts. When it comes to the gap between the head and the heart, it's important to identify and address the barrier of what's stopping that alignment, and then catalyze the patient's emotional response using immersion. Whether that's VR or the pause or the reflection or the yourself, you're crying and modeling that appropriate affect. And VR is an immersion tool that, just to review, provides a safe and controlled environment, can increase patient engagement, which we didn't really talk about, but I'll talk about now, allows for personalization of treatment, and increases treatment adherence. So, I know we talked about like 30 years worth of studies. One of the key findings of almost all the VR research within the world of behavioral health is that treatment adherence is higher. They haven't proved causality of why it's higher. We just have proved correlation, but we know that across the board, whether you're using VR with chemo patients or patients who have agoraphobia or patients who want relaxation and mindfulness training and those are just 3 of the studies we've participated in, but across the board, the treatment group that gets VR has higher treatment adherence by a pretty significant margin. So like in one 3-arm study, we found the difference of the VR group had like a 95.7% adherence rate versus the non-VR group had an 82.8% adherence rate. Just to give you guys a quick, note on that. And I'm proud of myself for remembering those numbers off the top of my head.
So lots of questions about Amelia here, and I know we're gonna.
Well, here's a slide.
Yeah. So I think actually it might be helpful to go back to the slide that shows the solution.
This one?
Yeah. And so just to be clear, this is Amelia's solution. And so could you just really quickly run through this one more time? And then I just want to clarify, because there's some questions about insurance. It's not that Amelia's delivering the service, it's actually you and your session and your therapy. So you're billing your insurance, and we can talk a little bit more on that topic, but I just wanted to be super clear about what it is that we offer. So
yes.
There are questions about where do I purchase the headset and all of these things. So for those of you who have specific questions about how this might help your practice, I do encourage you to meet with one of our representatives so we can learn a little bit more about your practice and your particular situation. We can give you a demo of the product so you can experience that. And then we can get into pricing for your situation. But I wanted to do a quick overview of that. We'll tell you a little bit more about our company, and I'll keep reviewing your questions and make sure we touch on the rest of these before we wrap up today.
Sounds good. Okay, so very high level. First of all, Amelia, one of the things that I love about our platform is the breadth. Okay, so Amelia has like 140, actually more. We're always releasing new stuff, environments. When you have an Amelia subscription, it's a subscription membership, you have access to everything on the platform. From there, you as a clinician, and again, I agree with Tamara, feel free to ask for a demo to really understand this better, but you open up an environment and you can configure that environment. So fear of driving on a highway, you can configure it to have no cars on the road, lots of cars on the road, some cars on the road. You can configure if it's day or night, raining or clear. Those are just some examples. You load up the environment on your platform, which loads it up on the headset or the mobile app in VR mode with a universal headset. And then when you load it up, the patient sees themselves driving in a car. From there, you then have the ability to make all sorts of things happen. You can make them speed up. You can make them slow down. You can make them change lanes. You can make the road curvy or straight. You can make them go over a bridge. You can make them go through a tunnel. You can make their engine fail. You can make them see an accident on the side of the road. All of that to help acclimate them, right, to driving under all sorts of different conditions. You'll see down here, the other piece I'll just quickly call out is when the session is over, it produces a report so you know exactly what happened during that session. The report includes a heat map, which shows you where their eyes were looking, which can be very, very helpful to actually share back to patients like, hey, I see that you were avoiding the main thing you were afraid of by looking behind you, or I see you were dead center the whole time. Like, are you okay? The platform allows you to measure and ask subjective units of distress using a colored Likert scale, which is key because when you click that button, you don't actually have to ask the question. It pops up in their headset and they can answer it without ever saying it out loud to you, and it gets reported in your report. And then we also have the electrodermal response sensors, which plug into the headset. These are harder to use if you're using remote work. It's mostly in session, but you can, kind of use their fingers and it works on the sweat response. And you can share back like, hey, you said you weren't that uncomfortable, but your sweat response tells me that you really were. So that's kind of the platform in a nutshell. There is asynchronous and synchronous sessions. Asynchronous is mostly homework. That's stuff you can assign out. Most folks assign it out on the mobile app. It's mostly mindfulness content to be used between session.
Okay, Michelle Dropkin from the CPT Center is asking, how do you see VR fitting into protocols like prolonged exposure for PTSD and ERP for OCD, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we have folks using them for both right now. I think that one of the things we talk a lot about, and I'll speak a little bit to the OCD stuff for half a second. So we have a bunch of OCD centers that use our product, mostly because that's all they're doing all day, all night. And I will say the most challenging part is that often, I'm going to quote a guy from No OCD who told me, the reality is most of the patients I see, most of their OCD thought processes surround taboo stuff, whatever they think is taboo, right? And that's really, really nuanced. So one example I'll just talk about that I use all the time with a patient that I have who's got pretty severe OCD is for about a year and a half. I live in right outside Chicago. And before the pandemic, I can't remember how early before the pandemic, but at some point there had been like a lot of crime on Michigan Avenue, which is like our fanciest street. And so they started posting, especially during the holiday season, cops up and down Michigan Avenue with guns, right? I mean, most cops in the US carry guns. It's a conversation for another day. I have lots of feelings about it, but not appropriate for here. But the point is there are cops with guns on many street corners. And my patient becomes so anxious about he doesn't go to Michigan Avenue for like a year because, and this is like the sweetest guy, okay? He's, an engineer, wouldn't hurt a fly, but he is convinced that if he goes to Michigan Avenue, he's going to walk up to one of the cops, pull out the cop's gun and just start shooting. Do we have an environment for Michigan Avenue and him walking up to one of the cops and pulling out his gun and starting shooting? No, but we do have a subway environment where you're standing on a platform and you can stand on a platform with people. So we use that environment a lot to practice what would happen if you just pushed one of those people off the platform. So I think it fits in very nicely, I guess, to prolonged exposure. And ERP, like I really do. But I guess I will say a lot of times in my experience, just working with customers across the globe, the folks that need ERP, they need it for thought processes that might not like be a one-to-one with what's on the platform. And that's where you have to get creative. I'm not sure if Michelle, that answers your question.
You feel free to let us know in the Q&A. We have some questions. Can you talk a little bit more about the electrodermal sensors and where they're placed? And
yes, so they're placed on these two fingers. What I will say about the electrodermal sensors, and okay, the good news is they're fully integrated with the platform. So that's what's awesome about them. Like it will measure as the experience is going. The part that I don't love about them, and we are thinking about alternatives, is that like you kind of have to sit, you don't have to be completely still, but they're incredibly sensitive. So if you have a patient like me who uses their hands to talk all the time, it becomes less accurate. A lot of folks, we're doing a lot of research right now to see if instead we could integrate with like a heart rate monitor. We think that would probably be better and hopefully less sensitive. They also need to be within like 68. There's some range, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there's a range of the like temperature that the office needs to be for them to be accurate. When they work, they're great. But there are, like, I want to be transparent, there are some limitations to them right now.
awesome. So we are just about wrapped up here. Can we let's just
go to the last
for
slide.
Those who are less familiar with Amelia, we were founded in 2014. Our customers are mental health professionals, and we have over 2,000 therapists globally in 70 countries using Amelia. We offer the most extensive VR library with over 140 virtual environments. And as Erica explained, Amelia can be used in person, remote, and there's also asynchronous options as well. I know there's a lot of questions about pricing, and I'm not able to address all of those today, but we are super happy to spend some time with you, learn more about your practice, and provide that information in a one-on-one session. So I shared the link a few times, but if you go to ameliavirtualcare.com in the top right corner, you'll see a request demo link. And if you fill that out, someone will follow up with you really quickly to schedule some time and answer all of your questions. So I want to thank you guys. What an awesome group of people. I got some really fun messages from people. We will follow up with a recording. So lots of questions about sharing the slides. We will send out the recording in the next couple days. And in the meantime, if you're interested in learning more, you'd like to see the environments themselves, want to see how the platform works, do get some time with our team. And if there's any burning last questions that pop up here, let me see. I think we're good. So that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Erica, for taking the time to share with us today your personal experience. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming.